When a young white male attacked several massage parlors in Atlanta this week, one fact leaked out. 6 of the 8 victims were Asian, leading many to call it a hate crime. That also put the media in a quandary, trying to rectify that narrative with information being released by investigators, while also dancing around the delicate matter of whether these were more than just massage parlors. From the start, there was no shortage of opinion over what happened in Atlanta. Most columnists echoed advocacy groups in calling it a hate crime and part of a larger wave of violence directed against Asian Americans.
Hate crimes against Asian Americans have been on the rise since COVID hit.
But what may seem obvious is not so simple for law enforcement. They say it's not clear the killer was motivated by racial hostility and that he blames a sex addiction for triggering him.
And it's a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate.
That resurrected speculation over what kind of business took place in these massage parlors. Coverage noted they were located in the city's red light district.
It is impossible to ignore that these killings happened at Asian businesses like this one directly behind me in Atlanta.
But any suggestion that sex was taking place was labeled victim shaming, with the Asian American Journalists Association cautioning the media to avoid terminology and connotations of prostitution or sexualization.
A number of cities held vigils overnight for the victims.
Meanwhile, what is clear is that confessed gunman Robert Aaron Long was targeting women. It's also clear, as the New York Times points out, that Long has a whole host of issues defined by religion, guilt, and lust. A former roommate at a rehab center described him as a religious fanatic with suicidal tendencies, obsessed with being judged by God. Whether he harbored resentment toward Asian women in particular is still not clear. You know, Susie, I want to start by just acknowledging I've never seen passions driven over a story like this about really, literally language issues. But I think I have to say I've fallen on the side of caution on this, that the media can't just go with seems like the obvious narrative without having all the facts. And in terms of even the Asian Journalists, American Journalists Association pushing back, I mean, if Long had attended those places and he had got sex acts in there, then I think that's reportable information. And, you know, it's not stigmatizing anybody or victimizing anybody if that was one of the facts.
Well, look, I think it's complicated because this happened in the context of this wave of Asian American violence, right? So that context did inform the situation and sort of heightened tensions and, as you say, really inflamed the way people thought about it. But, you know, look, these are always difficult situations, and breaking news situations you're trying to sort out through a lot of information. And I think a lot of the pushback was about the choice by some journalists to be stenographers rather than to contextualize that information. So yes, the police said that he claimed he wasn't racially motivated, but we know from a lot of shootings that most shooters, even those who are racially motivated, claim they are not racist. They think their beliefs are something other than that because they're not like part of the KKK. And we know that it is rare for a police spokesman to sort of speak as empathetically as he did about this victim, and that tends to happen usually when the shooter is white. I mean, that has just sort of historically been the case. So I think, you know, what people were asking for here was for journalists not to just take what the police said and use it as stenography, to just simply say, yes, it wasn't a race crime because this guy said it wasn't. It was definitely sexually motivated because he said he was, and he was having a bad day. Yeah. And I think, look, it also just speaks to the larger issue of diversity in newsrooms. I think, you know, if you have more people of color, they're going to naturally sort of hear things differently. And that's important. And I think that's what this week really highlighted.
Yeah, I think that we really have to listen to the shooter himself and the words that we know that he's told the police. He's made it very clear in my ears that this is a racially based shooting. This is a lynching, and that he has told the police that he was upset that there were Asian American women who he perceived to have control over him, and that he took it into his own hands. He became a vigilante to correct the social order of things. And if that's not a lynching, I don't know what is. The only difference is that he used a gun instead of a rope. I mean, this is, you know, when it's so clear to me that this is racially motivated, I don't think journalists have to necessarily be stenographers. They should really tell the truth and tell what it actually is. And when we don't do that, when we try to change the subject like the Boston Globe's editorial on Wednesday and try to say that this is an issue of gun control or, or others have said that this is an issue of sex addiction of an individual, I think we're missing the point. We're helping white law enforcement be able to hide behind their anti-Asian racist views. And I think the journalists at this moment, like Renee Graham did on Thursday, she called out her own editorial board for failing to make this point. And I think journalists on the street need to also be able to say what they see as their truth.
What happened in Atlanta certainly was racist in its effect. What's happened has terrorized the Asian community that, as Susie mentioned, was already under a lot of pressure from rising violence against them. And so in that regard, it almost doesn't matter what the shooter says or what the police are saying the shooter says. What matters is that this has contributed to the sense of fear and terror among Asians and Asian Americans. I can tell you some of my students are feeling this right now. Now, some of the initial speculation was just wrong. There was some initial speculation that this was a Trump supporter who was acting on Trump's racist rhetoric about the China virus, that sort of thing. That doesn't seem to be the case. But that certainly doesn't mean that race isn't wrapped up in this along with misogyny and other issues.
Yeah, I think that Dan has it right. And Susie, I agree with you that context certainly matters and is controlling here. But I also don't fault journalists for not labeling this as a hate crime. The issue here, hate crimes have a very strict legal definition, which is what the police have to abide by. And then there is the sense that I think most of us as observers would say qualifies as a hate crime. I doubt there's any issue with reporting what happened in the context of the victims being primarily, the majority of the victims, 4 of the victims are Asian, and the very fact that the shooter in this case patronized those places and may have had misogyny and anti-racist feelings. But I would not fault and don't fault at least the reporters for not leaping out and calling this a hate crime right away. It's horrible enough in just the particulars of the action itself without having to go there. So I'd leave that to the opinion writers.
Right, exactly.